We're back again, and this time around what we're going to be doing is talking about changing family relationships. So this is all going to be about not what happens on a structural level in terms of how families change, but what happens within families and in terms of what conjugal roles people do and how they have changed over time. So as per usual, I'm up into my little box in the left right hand corner, in my left and my right, and this is what we're going to be talking about today. So we're going to talk about conjugal roles, what they are. We're going to talk about the changes in conjugal roles, and then have a look at the ideas of two sociologists, well, rather three sociologists actually, but two different groups of sociologists, namely Willmott and Young, who suggests that actually we've had a big march of progress and that actually conjugal roles are so similar now that we actually can talk about symmetrical families. And then we're going to contrast that with the work of Oakley, who disagrees and says no, women still take on a dual burden in the family. And to finish us off, what I'm going to be doing is just having a quick chat about the role of children, not for any particular reason other than the fact that this is the only place I can kind of fit it in where it kind of makes sense. So let's start off by talking about conjugal roles. And conjugal roles are changing, but we need to know what a conjugal role is first of all. And what we're talking about is the roles or the jobs or the tasks that are played by people in a marriage or a cohabiting relationship. And what I've done is I'll give you just four examples there about different examples of conjugal roles. So paid work, who does work, who doesn't, cooking, childcare, I mean, it can be cleaning, leisure time as well. So leisure time is just the time that you're not spent working or doing any kind of domestic work. It's time when you are enjoying yourself. So we might think about how you spend your spare time, so to speak. And conjugal roles have changed drastically and massively over the last 70 years, and so therefore it's a big change and it's of interest to us as sociologists. So let's start by looking at how these conjugal roles have actually changed. Well, we can split conjugal roles up to two different types. We've got on the left hand side there, we've got segregated conjugal roles, and on the right hand side we've got joint conjugal roles. Now segregated conjugal roles are basically what we had in history, so in previous times, and we've moved slowly towards a more joined up conjugal roles relationship in families and households. So let's have a look then at what we've actually got here. So when we talk about segregated conjugal roles, what we're talking about is separate roles between a man and a woman, or a husband and wife, for instance. Separate work, separate housework, separate leisure time. And very much we associate these segregated conjugal roles with those traditional, conventional nuclear families. And indeed, the sociologist, the functionalist Talcott Parsons, even spoke about the idea of men having a specific set role, which he called the instrumental role, which basically means to go out and earn money for the family. And women, they would have also their set gender role, which would be called expressive role, which would basically be staying at home, looking after the kids and making sure the house is nice. That's basically what Parsons argues with instrumental and expressive roles. But we've moved beyond this, so the idea of men doing paid work, women staying at home, women doing the main, most domestic work, to a situation where we've got more joint conjugal roles. So this is a change that we've seen over time, and we've moved to more shared roles, so people sharing work, sharing domestic tasks, sharing their leisure time, so spending time with each other. We talk now, instead of about a conventional family, but a neo-conventional family. So this is something that is newer, and it's a term we associate with Robert Chester from 1985. And all he means by this is families where both partners, mum and dad, both work. So that's a good example straight away of a more joined up conjugal role. And what we think of in terms of these more recent roles in families is that they're more interchangeable. So these roles, these jobs can be done either by the husband or by the wife. So let's say talking about doing the childcare, you know, your dad might do that and your mum might do it. Doing the cooking, your mum might do the cooking, your dad might do the washing up, that kind of thing. And these roles are not fixed as in Parsons instrumental expressive. They are fluid, they change, and they're interchangeable as well. So what we're thinking about here, just to recap what we mean by shared or joint conjugal roles, both partners working, domestic tasks being shared, and fundamentally a more equal division of domestic labour. And what we mean by that, division, share, labour, work. Who does the work? It's more equally shared, particularly in the household. Now, of most interest to us is not what the changes are, but what the reasons are for these changes. And last video, I told you a whole different bunch of reasons about why family structures have changed and why we've got instances of increased rates of divorce and declining rates of marriage. Some of these things will overlap with them. So first and foremost, we're talking about changes in gender roles. And I mentioned this last time out, talking about the reasons why women might not let me start with that again. I talked last time out about how women might now go out and get work rather than just getting married for financial security. And this is a huge change over the last 50, 60, 70 years. And it's massively affected all aspects of households, particularly the way in which conjugal roles are conducted. So because women now have a greater chance in work, and we've had equality policies I mentioned last week, like the Equality Act, the Equal Pay Act, for instance, the Sex Discrimination Act, all of these things have enabled women to go out to work and take on a bigger share of paid work. So we now have these neo-conventional families where both partners work, or sometimes we talk about dual earner families or dual earner couples. And if you've got two incomes coming in, that's going to mean more money, and it's going to be in a higher standard of living. Now, not only that, we've also had a proliferation, so a new coming of technology, and this has also helped the move towards more joint conjugal roles. I'm not really with it today on this video. The other thing I'm going to talk about is social attitude. So I mentioned this previously, and I mentioned in the last video about the role of stigma, which is basically a negative association that someone can have about something. And we've lost this stigma around, for instance, women going out to work, or more commonly, men staying at home. So previously that would have been seen as a bad thing or an unusual thing to do. Or for instance, if men were taking significant roles in childcare, that would be seen as unusual or even deviant, so going against the social norms. But we've had the rise of things like the new man, and the new man is basically a man who is quite happy to get involved in those traditionally feminine tasks that were outlined by someone like Parsons in his expressive role. So the new man is a man who has adapted to the changes in the late 20th century, early 21st century, has become a lot more sensitive, has become more understanding of some of the roles and tasks that need to be done in households, and ultimately has come across as someone who's a bit more willing and a bit more fluid to move out of that fixed gender role that Parsons described. We can also talk about the normalization of family diversity and of individualistic lifestyles. So for instance, people now accept that, you know, lone parent families might be a thing, and how on earth are you supposed to share those conjugal roles if there's only one parent at home? So this is something else. And also the other thing as well, this is like something you probably won't mention hugely at GCSE, but if we think about how families have changed in the last sort of 150 years, going from an extended family structure staying in one place to once it's Shakespearean, then once we saw with Sean Connery there, once we saw the introduction of the Industrial Revolution, families moved from an extended structure to a nuclear structure, moved to the cities so the man could work, woman stays at home looking after the kids. And this again is what Parsons refers to as a functional fit between the nuclear family and what he called modern or industrial society. So this is something else that's happened. And if people are moving away from their extended families, then they're going to need to take on more work themselves, because, you know, granddad and grandma can't take on those things like childcare. Now, technology is a particularly interesting change that's led to more joined up conjugal roles. And we can think about the changes in technology both at home, so thinking about things like labour-saving devices, or by that what we mean by are things like, you know, microwave ovens, dishwashers, hoovers, I'm trying to think of other things, tumble dryers. All of these things have made domestic work a lot lighter and a lot quicker for people. So previously, if you were doing your washing, you'd spend a whole day just dedicated to washing clothes, putting them through the mangle, drying them out, and you need to be with them all day. So a woman would need to, traditionally a woman would stay at home on wash day, which traditionally was a Monday, right? These days, we don't have to worry about it. We throw our clothes in the washing machine, we press a few buttons, we leave it for a couple of hours, we come back, we stick them in the tumble dryer, and then like 4 or 5 hours later, the clothes that were originally dirty are now clean, and they're dry, and they're ready to wear again. So labour-saving devices at home have saved women time fundamentally. Also thinking about things like microwave meals, so not having to prepare a meal from absolute scratch, for instance. And so this saved time means that basically women, I'm talking women because this is traditionally the domain of women, would be able to have more time to do other things. They'd have a higher standard of living, so they wouldn't have to stay at home and do the washing all day. They could actually go out and enjoy some leisure time, or even pick up a part-time job, or indeed a full-time job. But it's not just at home where these, I'm going to mention the other thing as well, the commercialization of housework. What we mean by that is the idea that housework has now become a business. So you've got people like cleaners and you know, people who will look after your house for you for a price. So if you can pay those people, you don't have to do it, again, freeing up time. But also thinking about the labour changes, but the technology changes in the workplace as well. So if we go back 50, 60, 70 years, most jobs in Britain were manufacturing. So it's what we call secondary industry, making stuff effectively. Now that type of industry has really shrunk over the last sort of 50, 60, 70 years. We've gone through a process of what we call deindustrialization, and we now, most of us, work in service sector or tertiary sector jobs. And basically that means providing a service. So call centers, teachers, retail assistants, IT support workers, office workers, any of these kind of jobs would be service. Now, why is that important? It's because you do not have to be physically fit and strong to do those jobs. It's not like back in the day, going down the mine, being a farmer, being a builder, those kind of things. Anyone can do that irrespective of how physically strong you are, because most jobs these days just involve needing to use a computer and potentially a telephone. Okay, so those three big changes in gender roles, changes in social attitudes, and changes in technology have all contributed to the move towards more joined up conjugal roles. Now, there were two sociologists, two functionists actually, and here they are, Willmott and Young. And what they said basically is exactly what I've told you, is that they went out and did some research in London, firstly in the 1950s, I think it was 1957, and then they followed that up in 1973, studying how families and households do domestic work and how conjugal roles are split up. So who does what in the household? That's what they were interested in looking at. Now, what they found basically, especially in the 1970s, so they did two bits of research, one in the 50s, one in the 70s, went back in the 70s, and they found that actually these conjugal roles were increasingly being performed by both men and women, so they were interchangeable. The roles that were undertaken were very similar, and men and women were basically doing the same kind of stuff. And so what they talked about was there actually being a equality or a parity within the domestic division of labour. So who's doing what? It's a lot more equal than it used to be. And they refer to this, because families have become so joined up and similar, they refer to them as symmetrical families. And if you know what that symmetry is in maths, it's where one side of something looks exactly the same as something else. Now that's a little bit over the top, I think, because we're not talking about the idea of men and women doing exactly the same things, but we're talking about them doing very similar or interchangeable jobs. So if you think about, like, I don't know, let's say you've got to go and pick your kids up from football practice or dance practice, your mum might drop you off, your dad might pick you up. That's a good example of a shared role, or an example of a conjugal role undertaken by a symmetrical family. Now, probably the hardest bit I'm going to talk about today is about Willmott and Young's concept of why families were becoming more symmetrical. And their big argument was about this thing called stratified diffusion. And basically what this means is where, the culture of and way of life of wealthier people kind of like filters down to those in the rest of society, and those in lower classes. So when Willmott and Young were doing their research, looking in working class areas of Bethnal Green in East London, they were starting to see how these ideas and things like labour saving devices were being kind of like almost like trialled by the richer people in society. And as they were becoming normalised and successful in their households, this filtered down. So it's like, you might have heard of the phrase keeping up with the Joneses, which basically means that if one other family, one other household's got something that's working really well for them, you want to get that as well. So stratified diffusion is a great way that Willmott and Young explained how families are becoming more symmetrical. And a good example of this would just be by purchasing labour-saving devices. So in the family, you might previously not have had a washing machine. You go out and buy a washing machine. That means then that at least somebody, probably the woman in the household, doesn't have to spend all day doing it. And in fact, anyone can work a washing machine, despite what my dad does, because I don't think he's done the washing in quite a while. And that's in fact something that other sociologists picked up on, least of all people like Anne Oakley. So we've got Anne Oakley, and she was vehemently against the idea of symmetrical families put forward by Willmott and Young, and she said that they greatly exaggerated this concept of symmetry in families. So Oakley actually went out and did her study a year after Willmott and Young's symmetrical families in 1974, and what she found is that women still did the vast majority of domestic work and childcare, so not really as symmetrical as Willmott and Young put forward. Oakley's key concept about explaining why women do more in the household is put forward through her concept of a dual burden, dual meaning two. And what Oakley suggests is that because women do the vast majority of domestic work, so cooking, cleaning, looking after the kids, preparing food, whatever, and they also now go out and do paid work, they do two main jobs in the household, paid work and domestic work, whereas men are only still doing that paid work because they're not taking on a fairer share of domestic work. So what Oakley basically said is that Willmott and Young criticised, excuse me, what Oakley said is that Oakley said that Willmott and Young exaggerated the concept of a symmetrical family, because in her own research, she asked men and women who does what in the household, and she found that only 15% of men had high levels or did high levels of housework, and only 1/4 had a significant role in childcare. So what we can see there between the differences between Willmott and Young's study in 1973 and Oakley's in 1974 is a difference of opinion as to how much or how joined up these conjugal roles have become. Willmott and Young suggest very much joined up. In fact, it's so joined up it's symmetrical. Oakley says no, they've completely exaggerated that, and women still do the vast majority of housework, leading to women having a dual burden. Now, I mentioned at the start I was going to talk about the changing role of children in families, and this doesn't really fit with the stuff that I've done, but I've got a bit of time and I'm going to cover this as well. Now, there are two main kind of things we need to understand about how the role of children has changed in society. The first is how families view or see children, and we talk about this as society and families becoming increasingly child-centric, and this just means that children are the most important things in families. They are at the centre of everything we do, at the centre of all our thinking, our decision making, and arguably at the centre of the reason why we work as hard as we do. Children should be cherished and protected and seen as like innocent and vulnerable, and that's kind of like, yeah, we might think that's obvious, but that is not the way that kids have always been seen. So if we think about in the past, let's go back to Victorian days, children and childhood was seen very differently. We sent kids to work in factories, up chimneys, those kind of things. We didn't have any laws that protected the abuse or the exploitation of children. And actually children were seen as being seen and not heard. They were a bit of an inconvenience to families overall, unless of course they were earning them some money. But the other thing we need to be aware of with childhood, and this kind of relates to how we can explain why we've seen these big changes in childhood, is that childhood is not a natural thing. It's something, the concept of childhood, when we think what is childhood, it's something that we as humans in the society we've made up, and therefore we call it a social construct. It doesn't exist in the natural world. And we associate this idea with someone called Philip Ayres, who was a French sociologist. And Ayres basically argues that childhood differs around the world and in different times, so according to its social context. So the example that Ayres would give is that kids used to be treated much like adults. They would be sent out to work. They had no laws protecting them. So all of those kind of things. And the way that we now see children is very different. We don't see them as going out to work or as having no rights. In fact, quite the opposite. They've probably got rights protecting them in all sorts of ways. And how we see childhood is very much, according to Ayres, a construct of our time. So 21st century Britain, place, Britain, and our culture. And the last thing to say, look at that, that was great. I'm going to do it once more. Why not? We've got a boomerang, and this relates to boomerang children. And what we mean by the phrase boomerang children is that often today what we see is that when kids grow up, they will leave the nest, so they'll leave the family home, often maybe to go off to work, get their own house, or to go to university or something. But in contrast to previous times, when kids would go off and they would stay wherever they were going, nowadays it's very common, and myself, I did this as well, much to mum and dad's delight, go off to university, go off and get a job. Then maybe when things don't pan out as well, or perhaps you've lost your job or something, you can come back and move back in with mum and dad. So this is a very common thing, particularly at the moment, because of the fact that it's so difficult for people to get on the property ladder. So young single people, potentially very difficult to get on the property ladder. You can't get a house, can't buy a house, so let's move back in with mum and dad. So that wraps up the fourth video today, which was looking at changing family relationships. Just to recap what we've covered about today, we've talked about conjugal roles and what conjugal roles are, i.e. the jobs or the tasks that people play in a family or a cohabiting relationship. We talked about the ways that conjugal roles have changed from being more kind of segregated and split, where men and women do different things in the household, to over time becoming more joined up. And so people are sharing those conjugal roles, sharing jobs, work, leisure time. And that led to people like Willmott and Young suggesting that families had become symmetrical, where men and women do such equal, similar shares of work that they're basically the same. But it was contrasted and I don't know what I'm going for there, criticised by Anne Oakley, who basically says that this is a load of old rubbish and that women are still doing the vast majority of domestic work at home, as well as now having paid work, so they suffer a dual burden. And then we just finished off there by considering the role of children in society, by looking at those two concepts. Firstly, the idea that childhood is a social construct, so it changes throughout time. place and culture. And secondly, the idea that childhood now is, or children now are seen as really important, and we now argue that our families and our society as a whole is child-centric, with kids right at the center of it. So there we go, that's video number 4. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you found something of interest to you. Another fairly lengthy one, but hopefully that's not been too off-putting for you. A reminder that if you've gone fast over any of this stuff, all you've got to do, go back and pause the video. If there's something that I haven't explained very well, probably a lot, then just drop me an email, hello@allsociology.co.uk, and I will be able to explain to you what it was I was trying to communicate that I failed miserably. If you've enjoyed it, if you've liked it, do me a favor, subscribe to us on YouTube, bob us a like, go over to Instagram and follow us at All Sociology, or pick us up on our Facebook page. All right, that's it again for number 4. Until next time, peace out, take it easy, and I'll see you again very, very soon. Bye.